Well, thank you for coming back. We are halfway through.
We had a choice.
And you didn't have a choice. That's right. Thank you, Lee. So we're glad that you came back. As every week, I like to start off with kind of some of Paul's world that'll help us understand him. And so I'd like to spend our opening moments today talking about just a day in the life of a typical person in the Greco-Roman world. Now, I say that, and I have to also say at the same time, there wasn't really a typical person in the Greco-Roman world because there were lots of different variations in status. And so I'm going to give us the idea of what might life had been like for someone like Philemon, a relatively well-to-do person, a man who was a freedman, possibly a Roman citizen, and was what we might call in our world a middle class or upper middle class. It's a wrong language, doesn't fit their categories, but it's someone who's doing pretty well. And so for starters, this is the typical floor plan for a Greco-Roman wealthy person, relatively wealthy person. It was basically all aligned on two squares or two rectangles. The front is here at the far left side. There would be one door that would lead into an open air atrium. I say open air, there would be a hole in the ceiling right above where that square is, and that would allow rainwater to come and to fall down. The rainwater could be collected. In some cases it just went out. Some cases they collected the rainwater or used it for the household needs. Around the periphery of the house, these different rooms can be used as offices or bedrooms or dining rooms. Sometimes these front rooms here, close to the front door, these rooms would actually be closed off and open to the street as a shop. So you wouldn't be able to get into the house. You would just have a shop there. Sometimes they'd operate as a shop out of the front, and then you could go back into the atrium for the house if the homeowner was running the business out. Sometimes they would use some of their slaves to run a business out from the front of the house like that. But the typical Philemon Roman male would get up in the morning, have a small bite to eat, usually leftover bread and cheese and whatever from the meal the night before, and then would begin doing his business. And if he was a wealthy person, he would have slaves, and the different people that reported to him would come in the morning and get their assignments for the day. And so he would often start his day at this little square in the middle of the house called the tablino. That was his office, and you would have kind of a curtain usually there, maybe some kind of desk, and he would be working there as people would come to him to get their assignments for the day, and he would make sure everyone is doing his bidding. If you want to have an image, think about the scene in The Godfather, where everyone's coming to the Godfather to get, what should we do with this or that? That's not a bad image for us to understand a wealthy Roman and how his day would start. So he would go, he would work, he would send out his people to do their work throughout the day, and then the workday would continue on through most of the morning. Now I have a picture here. This is taken from that office, that tablino, that office room, and it's looking through the atrium to the front door of the house. And so this is in Pompeii at the house of the tragic poet, but you can see a wall right here that's kind of would section off the little office area, the atrium, the water collector right there in the middle, and then the front door, and then these rooms would be bedrooms or dining rooms or what have you off the side. This is at another house, and you can see this is a shop built into the front of a house. And it has a door leading into the house. And so the owner of the home likely either ran the business or had someone run the business for him. Now, at the end of kind of midday, Our Roman might go out and be checking on different things. He might be engaged in commerce, so he might leave his house and go and do business with various other people throughout the city. And along the way would be lunchtime. And lunch was not a very big meal for him, but he might stop at a little pop-up stand like this. It's called a papaday. And this little kind of roadside tavern, he could get hot food, bread, or maybe some kind of perhaps a kind of a gruel or lentil type soup. There would be fire in one end of that kind of bar, and it's a hollow bar with ceramic jugs in the middle, and so the fire would heat down through that bar so the food could be kept hot. And so he could purchase a small bite of food to eat there, not a big meal by any means. And then from about 1 o'clock on or so, his day would be all about leisure. Now, this wasn't just for the wealthy. This is really the Roman schedule. You would work early in the morning to a little bit after midday, and the rest of the afternoon was about enjoying life, was about enjoying the good things of life. And one of the good things that people of all different classes enjoyed were going to the baths. They might go to, they had bath complexes, and they might go first to the gymnasium, which was often a part of the bath, and do some exercise, some wrestling, or have some massage therapy or something like that. And then they would go for a relaxing time in the bath. This is a locker room. You can sort of see the little cubby holes there where they could place their belongings. A lot of times they would have an attendant who would be there to watch their belongings for them as they left and went to enjoy. But for the most part, these are public baths. And so they would be free or very cheap. And so most of the people from the bottom statuses on up would be able to participate. And this was where sometimes you would see some mixing of socioeconomic classes. This is a little bit light, but you can see a stone bench there in the locker area where they would change. Now the typical structure of the Roman baths had 3 different rooms. The first is called the caldarium. It's the hot room. And you can see this here. This is in Pompeii. And this room, there's a small basin with cool water there that you'd use to kind of, put water on your head to cool yourself off, to maintain your own composure, because they would get this room really, really hot. The floor was actually raised on pedestals and had tiles on top. And so they would pump heated or steaming water in through the floor. And then also they had channels in the wall that steam could come up to. So you would get really, really hot in there. They did have occasions where people would pass out, or perhaps even die because it got so hot and they got dehydrated and whatnot. On the other end, if you imagine just turning and facing the other way here in the caldarium, there was a pool, a small pool, and it also had hot water in it. You can see that recessed there. And then there would be another room called the tepidarium. And in some of the places, it would be kind of a lukewarm bath. In this particular bath in Pompeii, the tepidarium there did not have any kind of bath feature. It was just a kind of a mid-level cool-down room. You gain your composure, maybe stop sweating, stop seeing spots or whatever, and get ready to go into the cool-down room called the frigidarium. And this had just a big base and a big, in this case, round pool. And people could go and just enjoy the cool water, enjoy their having sweated out all the toxins now, have a refreshing dip, and just be kind of relaxed. And so this was pretty normal. This would be a part of their day. They would go, a couple of hours here at the baths. They might have somebody give them a massage, do other kinds of oil treatments or different sorts of we might call pseudo-medicine type health treatments. And then they would also be doing, while they're at the baths, they would be doing what happens in health clubs all over the place. Gossip and business. A lot of times mixed together. And this really was, there were quite a number of deals that were done at the baths. And there would be quite a lot of storytelling that would go on at the baths. But this was a fixture of Greco-Roman life.
So was it all men?
This was men, yes. You would bathe separating the genders, but they had baths for women. There is a woman's bath not too far from this one in Pompeii. And sometimes they would have a slightly staggered schedule, I've read. But yeah, it was big for everybody to participate in the baths.
So when you see these things in the movies, they're always, pristine and clean, with blue waters and everything. What's the likelihood of that?
The question is, would it be pristine and clean with perfectly blue water? I don't know that that's how it was, but the Romans really were far better at hygiene than we give them credit for. And they were not bad at even providing clean drinking water to their people. By using aqueducts, they've gotten water to places that shouldn't, that didn't have any other water source on their own. By using an open aqueduct system where the water is exposed to the sunlight, the UV from the sun actually kills a lot of the pollutants in the water. So, for instance, here in Pompeii, you would have a public drinking fountain out here on the corner with clean water. So, all that to say, in the baths themselves, I would imagine they would certainly be beautiful. Again, these are people that have a high value for aesthetics. So they would be colorful, they would be painted up, there would be attendants making sure that things are not getting out of hand. There would be pressure from the influencers to make sure that this is a nice place. The color of the water, who knows? I would say probably not a Bahama blue, but neither should we think about the people jumping into something that's just disgusting, because they would have more scruples than that. Here's another fountain, and you can see, this is a later brass fitting that's been put in so it can be used for drinking water now. But yeah, these folks lived, and they didn't have a bad life. There are worse places. If you got forced into a time machine and sent somewhere to live, anytime, there's a lot of time periods that would be a lot worse than this one. There'd be a lot of things that wouldn't be so great. But after spending their times at the baths, or sometimes at these bath halls, there would be a lecture hall that would be attached to it, where you might hear a philosopher come and teach or speak. Another thing that would be done in that leisure time, rather than go to the baths, say, you might go to the theater to see, the latest, I would say not Shakespeare, but the latest production that is put together for the time, the latest drama or tragedy. Or you might go to see some games, some gladiatorial games. That was another form of entertainment that the people would do. And that's pretty typically done in that afternoon time. Now, a big thing that the people are trying to do as they're at the baths and as they're milling about, they're trying to get a dinner invitation or somewhere that night. Because who you dine with determines your real value, your real status. And everyone wants to go be invited to a party. And so that's constantly something you see people kind of jostling for. Like we might, in junior high, might jostle to get invited to the cool table. In the Greco-Roman world, you're going to try to go get close to somebody who's throwing a party that night so you can get invited there. Because if you go to so-and-so's party, then, okay, now that opens up new opportunities for you in business. That opens up just a new sense of value to your standing in that community. And so people are always trying to get to be a part of a dinner party. And these parties are very common. The ancients didn't like to eat alone. They wanted to socialize and enjoy life. And that was the big meal of the day. That was when they would come and they would have a lot of their, of course, a lot of wine. They would have, if it was a wealthy party, they might have some fish, maybe even some chicken. Pork was a common meat. Meat wasn't super common. For a wealthy person, more so. For a more poor person, meat would be something they would get around the time of the pagan festivals, when the temples are serving it and distributing it widely as a part of the celebration. But the parties would be a big time for socializing. That's also a time when you might hear a traveling speaker who's been invited to the party come and tell about, tell us the latest stories from Philippi, or what's the latest news out of Ephesus, or, have they built the new temple there yet, or, things like that. So dinner time was really when you would socialize and when you would connect, and when quite a lot of, it's just what life was all about. That's when life happened, was around the dinner table.
Was this thought about being socially up by who you eat dinner with, was that prevalent in Jesus' day?
Yes. Yeah.
Does that read all the more about him going to eat with sinners?
Absolutely. The question is, did the importance of who you ate with, did that factor into Jesus and his story? And it absolutely did. Again, Jesus and Paul are in Israel. At least that's where Paul is educated. That's where Jesus spends his entire earthly ministry. But all of Israel still is under the Greek culture and the Roman government. And so, like we talked about, those three worlds have kind of collided. And so, yes, for Jesus to eat with somebody who's a sinner, that is a scandalous thing. That's a scandalous thing for who he is and what he's trying to do. Because he shouldn't be doing that. He should be going and getting invited to dinners with the wealthy people. He should be getting invited to dinners with the Sadducees. Maybe even with someone like Herod Antipas. Maybe. That if he really has an upward trajectory, if he's an upwardly mobile Messiah figure, that's what he should be trying to do. The fact that he's choosing instead to go spend time with prostitutes and sinners, tax collectors and this sort, means he doesn't understand how the world works, and he's also taking on some of their bad reputation on himself. That's why it's such a big deal that he eats with him. Now, I mentioned the house again. These larger rooms here, you can see there's the dining room was called the triclinium. And I'll explain why in just a moment. But you can see here in the front half, here's likely a triclinium, a dining room here. And then on this side, right here in the back half of the house was a garden. And so depending on the time of year, you would probably have, in the winter months, it would be warmer to eat, or maybe just the spring and fall. You might eat here on the triclinium by the garden because it would be a little bit more open air. You'd have a little bit more airflow. And here, the one by the atrium, yes, there's still some fresh air coming in, but it's a little bit more closed in, so it'd be a little bit more comfortable in the winter months or also in the summer if you don't want to have too much. So the more extreme temps, the more you might want to go to the slightly more insulated dining hall. Some houses had more than two. Some of them had 3 or 4. Some of them just had 1. So this is kind of a basic visual of it. Now, a large Roman villa like this would have a kitchen where the food would be prepared. And then here's a good picture into one of the dining halls, one of the triclinium rooms. And again, you see frescoes covering the walls. You can't see it real here, but there was a mosaic square right in the middle of that floor. And then I pulled this from the Biblical Archaeology Review. This is an illustration of what dining would have looked like inside the triclinium. It's called the triclinium because there were three tables, and they would be set up in an inverted U shape, and you would lie out on the couches there and be able to reach up with your right hand and grab the food from the table. Servants would come and would set the food out on the table, and then would gather it up. Typically, the host would be seated over here on the left side, either the second or the third position, and the guests of honor would be to his right. And then the way that it works is the servants would come in, would bring the food. You'd start with the food over here by the host and the guests of honor, and then would work your way around the table to the lesser importance people, and they get to have the leftovers. So where you sit matters. And every person at the table would know where they're sitting. They would know the status. So it's not like these round tables that are all democratic and you're all equal. No, sir. You know who you are by where you're seated.
So is that where the term came from, the right hand?
At the right hand?
At the right hand?
Yeah. There's probably a lot to that. I don't know the full extent of it, but yeah, there's probably a lot to that. All right, one more pick. This is a garden. I showed you the gardens inside the house. You can see this garden inside. This is also the house of the tragic poet, I believe. And so nice garden area. If you see over here on the far right, that little alcove, that's a shrine called a lararium. That would be where the house shrine was, where they would have their gods, maybe a family deity or some other little idol that they would set up and pay tribute to, probably at the end of the day before going to sleep. Same, they'd have their good luck charms and protect us during the night. Nighttime was a fearful thing in the ancient world, and so I don't know if they had a quiet time per se, but many of the people most certainly would say some sort of prayer or chanting before going to bed, some sort of good luck ritual to watch over them during the night.
Things haven't changed that much.
People are people. It's remarkable. Yeah, there's a lot of things that are very different, but then there's a lot of things that are very similar. An herb garden? It very well could be. It very well could be. In the Mediterranean world, they did like herbs. They did use them, yes. That's a fantastic question, Richard. All right, any questions on the daily life? Dottie? Did they have ice? I've never thought to ask that. I have no idea. I'm going to have to research and find out. Did they have ice? Such a fresh question. I've never thought of that. It's great. All right, Sandra.
You mentioned that these pictures are in Pompeii.
Yes, ma'am.
Is this an area that was not destroyed by the volcano? Or has this been reclaimed from the ruins?
Yeah, so the question is, have these been destroyed by the volcano or are they rebuilt? And it's kind of a compilation of both. Some of the things have been restored, but most of the city wasn't destroyed by a volcano. It was buried by the ash. And so what killed the people was when the volcano erupted, this was in 79 AD, they had a rush of hot gases that came through and killed everyone that was left. But then the city was just progressively buried by ashes. And so what killed the people was when the volcano erupted, this was in 79 AD, they had a rush of hot gases that came through and killed everyone that was left. But then the city was just progressively buried by ashes. And so what killed the people was when the volcano erupted, this was in 79 AD, they had a rush of hot gases that came through and killed everyone that was left. But then the city was just progressively buried by ashes. And so most of the buildings were intact at some level. Now, a lot of roofs have caved in, but there's still plenty that are there. Some have been put back, had the roofs put back on them artificially or been restored in that way. But it's amazing how much was left. And there's still about 20 to 25% of the city that hasn't been excavated, even though excavations have been off and on since the 1700s. They're holding that back, waiting as archaeological methods are improved. They can go in and find more and more is the idea behind it anyway.
What is the climate over there? It seems pretty open in the area.
Yeah, the climate in the Mediterranean it's pretty warm, pretty comfortable. So yeah, this was June. It was about 80, give or take. So, Richard, y'all were there. March.
Freezing and cold and it was rainy.
Okay. Gotcha.
So I'm assuming these houses, these fortresses, would have been, passed from one generation to the next, and things of that nature. When you were over there, could you see any evidence of, maybe adding on to a house to make a bigger family or anything like that?
Yes. Okay. This is a great question. Did we see any evidence of houses being added on to, or were they kept the same? Were they passed down from generation to generation? Now, when we were there was a lot of things that would have escaped our eyes. But you would have a square, they call it an insula, and you would have a few houses there on that square. But yeah, there's one house that had taken over at least 2 other houses, and so you would have 2 atriums or 3 gardens, and these were just massive homes, and it was very obviously, yes, someone had come and wanted to take or purchase the house next door for their expanding household. And so, yeah, we know that happened. We see evidence of that. So you see some things where the house had been, it's clear to archaeologists, the house had been flattened and rebuilt, and lots of other similar type renovations and things they would have done very much like we do. Yeah. Good questions.
Two-story houses? Multiple stories?
Houses were usually 1 story. Sometimes there would be 2. They did have apartment buildings, and those were especially prevalent in the cities, and they could be anywhere from 3 to 5 stories up. In Rome, they got up to 7 stories, and there was some imperial regulations said that they shouldn't be built any more than 7 stories. But they face the same thing that we do in our big cities of, there's not enough land, there's people, we've got to make space. You can't make more space out, you go up. And so, that absolutely happens. So
The Philippines is like that too.
same thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because it's so demanding.
That's good.
No, I'm just curious. All the buildings are made of the same type of rocks, or these rocks there, or were there specific rocks?
A lot of the buildings are made out of brick. Some are made out of a stone or a marble. I didn't notice any others. I don't know if y'all have any that you noticed.
I think they were made out of the brick and then originally covered in the marble.
Yeah.
Our guide, there's several places over there where the downstairs would be the shop, and you can still see ruts where the gate would be, where they would close it at night or in the afternoon, and then take the stairways to go up to their house immediately above it. So they didn't have to commute very far to work. The shopkeepers did.
That's the way it is in my country from Jamaica. And the houses are upstairs, but it's with the shops. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're right.
It's amazing to see how much is still left, how much we still can see, and we'll see how that informs us. So let's go ahead and dive into Paul. If you want to pick up in Acts chapter 18. So after the second missionary journey, Paul had gone back to Antioch, Syria, his base, and spent some time there. And then the Lord moved in Paul's heart again, and he was ready to go on. And we read this in Acts 18, verse 23. After spending some time in Antioch, Paul set out from there and traveled from place to place throughout the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. So again, he's going back to those Galatian churches, those churches that he established there on his first missionary journey. And so he makes his way over land. And again, we're guesstimating. We don't get a lot of detail there, but imagine him going and visiting these various churches like Antioch and Lystra and Iconium. And this time, he does make it out to Ephesus. If you remember, on his second missionary journey, it seemed as though he was trying to get there, but the Spirit wouldn't allow him to go into that province. And so he was redirected. This time, he does get to make it into Ephesus. This is in approximately 53 AD. And Ephesus is a booming city at this time. About 250,000 is the estimated population. And in particular, in the Middle East, on everything that's east of Greece, Ephesus is the city. This is the place to be. And so Paul had wanted to go and to preach there. We have a sense of his desire to go and preach in populous areas. We see that's kind of his trademark, or one of the ways that he does. And so he goes and he begins to minister there in Ephesus. In Acts 19, he starts out by going, he sees some people that have believed, or at least heard the message from John the Baptist. And when Paul tells them about the resurrection of Jesus, they receive Christ and are baptized into the Spirit. Then in Acts 19:8, Paul entered the synagogue and spoke boldly there for 3 months, arguing persuasively about the kingdom of God. Again, his MO has always been to go and to preach the gospel in the synagogues first. And then, a typical refrain, some of the people become obstinate. Some of the Jews refused to listen, to believe, and publicly maligned the way. And so Paul left them. And we read that he took his disciples with him and had discussions daily in the lecture hall of Tyrannus. Now remember what we said, in the afternoons, when they had leisure time, people would go to the baths, and many of the baths sometimes would have a lecture hall attached to it or near in the proximity. This is how Paul is doing his evangelism, how he's doing his teaching there in that afternoon in Ephesus. This went on for 2 years, we're told, verse 10, so that all the Jews and Greeks who lived in the province of Asia heard the word of the Lord. Ephesus is where we see Paul have one of his most significant ministries. He has a lot that goes on. There's quite a significant ministry at Corinth, but in Ephesus, he stays an even longer period of time, and we see amazing things that are reported here. Verse 11, it says that God did extraordinary miracles through Paul, so that even handkerchiefs and aprons that had touched him were taken to the sick, and their illnesses were cured, and evil spirits left them. So this is just a sense of how significant his ministry is. If you skip on down, in verse 18, it says, many of those who believed now came and openly confessed what they had done. Verse 19, a number who had practiced sorcery brought their scrolls together and burned them publicly. Remember, we talked last week about letter writing and how expensive books were. Every one of these are hand copied, taken hours and cost a significant amount. So you're seeing the gospel is having a profound effect on how people act. When they calculated the value of the scrolls, the total came to 50,000 drachmas. A drachma is about a day's wage. So 50,000 days' wages burned there in that moment. And in this way, the word of the Lord spread widely and grew in power. Then, after all this had happened, Paul decided to go to Jerusalem, passing through Macedonia and Achaia. And then we read, after I've been there, also Paul said, I must visit Rome. And he sent 2 of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, to Macedonia. And he stayed in the province of Asia a little longer. All right, so he is meeting here for, by our estimate, about 2.5 years in the meeting hall of Tyrannus. He's seeing a tremendous amount of ministry. He's seeing people come to faith in Christ. During this time, we have a pretty good idea from one of the letters that the Colossian church is started because a guy named Epaphras comes to Ephesus, hears the gospel, and goes back to his hometown of Colossae. We know that Paul doesn't go to Colossae, and he references there in Colossians 1 that Epaphras is who carried that message. And we see Paul affecting not just the Jewish community, not just a small group, but actually having an impact on the city itself. And what we see unfold in the next bit is when we really get a sense of what a big disruption the gospel has brought to Ephesus. And so near the end of Paul's time, I forgot to tell you this, Paul is thought to be in Ephesus from about 53 to 56. Let me not get ahead of myself. First of all, let's point out this is one of the main roads in Ephesus. It's the road that leads down. It actually leads up from the marketplace. The marketplace is down there behind us, and it leads up to kind of the civic area. There's a small theater that the civic leaders would have met in. And you can see, if you go straight down that road, you can see a building with kind of some tall columns. That's the library there at Ephesus. Now, it wasn't built by Paul's time. It was built about 120. But you can get a sense of the grandeur of the city. This road would have been lined with statues of citizens who have, established some importance of themselves for one reason or another. There would have been various temples to the side. And then down on one hill, these are more of those wealthy Roman homes like we looked at in Pompeii. They're harder to see, they're harder to make out, and the excavation has just begun on some of them. If you see this building over here to the right, that's covering some of those homes. And you can see, this is inside that building, so you can see a hallway, some dining rooms or bedrooms there. It's a little bit harder to get a sense of where one house starts and another stops. And they were built right into the hillside there. Now I just like this collection of clay pipes. Just get a sense of kind of the plumbing of the day, some of it. This is one of the baths there in Ephesus, and you can just barely see the pedestals from the heated floor. And then up here, if you look, there's a little channel running along that wall. Do you see that? That's where the steam would have been channeled up to heat the caldarium there at the bath. And then there's a little, probably from the tepidarium, I don't know, little pool there. So we don't know anything about the lecture hall of Tyrannus where Paul is preaching. Could have been in connection with this bathhouse. We have no idea. All right, if you'll indulge me a little bit of Arkansas humor. This is the public toilet. And it's very public. And
Is that today
that
or back then?
That's back then. That is Paul's era. Yeah. No.
It's today in Arkansas.
That's
Oh, no, not that long.
Richard. You're censored for the rest of the day. So. All right. Let me jump ahead.
Would there have been walls around it, or no? It was just out.
That was an enclosed building,
Okay.
but you're close to your seatmate.
Yeah.
Yes. It-
Were the genders separated?
Were the genders separated? That's a great question. I don't know for certain. It seems in my mind as though they were. I'm gonna bet yes, but I don't know that for certain.
I'm just-
We'll pretend that they were, just to
I'm
be.
asking whatever rule didn't apply.
Yes, did not.
Do I dare ask how they were cleaned?
I'm going to put it to a vote. I can tell you that. Do y'all want to know how a person was clean in that situation?
The toilets.
Okay. All right. I've read this stuff, so I can answer it. The toilets themselves, no, I don't know how they were cleaned. They were fed by a consistent stream of running water, so it's kind of an automatic flush that was built in. And so that eliminated some amount of cleaning that needed to be done. In most cases, if there's a bad job to be done, expect slaves to do it. Yep.
What was old age in those days?
Old age, it can vary. For a man, a Roman citizen, yeah, you might make, if you're healthy, you might make it into your 80s. That was not uncommon. Slaves had a far less likely chance of making it that far. Women didn't have as good a chance of making it that far because of childbirth. The Romans actually made it. If you were a Roman woman who gave a Roman citizen, a Roman woman whose father was a citizen, if you had 3 live children that were born, then you were freed from being under the authority of your father. And I want to say that they gave them citizenship status. I may be wrong on that. But there were certain freedoms that a woman was given after that because it was so rare and because it was a significant thing. So let's get to Artemis. Now Artemis is the fertility goddess, and the Ephesians thought of her as their own. She dwelled in Ephesus in a special way. She was worshipped in other places. The Roman name for her was Diana, but she was a Greek goddess first. And so for any kind of childhood or fertility or even some parts of dealing with your animals, Artemis was worshipped. Women played a leading role in the worship at Artemis's temple. And she was responsible. She was the one that would protect them a lot in childbirth. There's a real interesting passage, a real interesting phrase, I should say, in 1 Timothy 2. You remember when it talks, where Paul's writing, and women should learn in quietness and submission, all that. At the end of that passage, Paul says, but nevertheless, women will be saved in childbirth. There's been a lot of different explanations. It just almost doesn't seem to fit there, right? Well, we're talking about order in the church and worship in the church. Why is it talking about childbirth? I think, and I've learned this from others, I think it's because Paul is reassuring the Ephesian women that are now worshiping Jesus, that are no longer participating in the Artemis worship, that Jesus is going to protect them as they give birth. They no longer have to look to Artemis or fear as they're approaching childbirth, fear that because they're not paying their diligence or making their sacrifices to Artemis, that they will somehow be unsafe. I think it's Paul saying, Jesus will provide for your protection. You feel like your neighbors are telling you because you're no longer making sacrifices to Artemis, you're no longer participating in the big parade leading into her temple, that now somehow you're doomed to have miscarried children for the rest of your existence. And Paul is saying, no, Jesus is providing for you. That's how I think we should understand that verse. Well, pagan worship is not just something that people hold dear. It's also pretty good business, at least in Ephesus it was. There were silversmiths that made a bunch of statues of Artemis. And apparently they had a pretty good business at it. Because in Acts 19, verse 23, we're told that about that time there was a great disturbance about the way, Christianity. A silversmith named Demetrius, who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought in a lot of business for the craftsmen there. He called them together along with the workers in other trades and said, my friends, we have a good income from this business. And you've seen here how this fellow Paul has convinced and led astray large numbers of people here in Ephesus and in practically the whole province of Asia. He says that gods made by human hands are no gods at all. That kills our business. But there's danger, not only that our trade will lose its good name, and imagine him winking as he says this part, but also that the temple of our great goddess Artemis will be discredited, and the goddess herself, who is worshipped throughout the province of Asia and the world, will be robbed of her divine majesty. In other words, he's hurting our bottom line, but he's also hurting our great goddess too, right? So it's not really just about the wallet, guys. We have a more virtuous argument here. We need to put a stop to this dude. And so when they hear this, they're furious and they begin shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians," and the whole city was soon in an uproar. The people seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions, and all of them rushed into the theater together. Paul wanted to appear before the crowd, but his disciples would not let him. So here's the theater in Ephesus. And it goes on behind me up the hill. The top portion is no longer missing. The theater in the first century would seat about 25,000 people. And the people start chanting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians," for 2 hours. Now, the acoustics in this theater are such that I can get down there on the bottom and I can speak in a voice about like this, and it'll project my voice up, and it can be heard in just about any seat there, just because of the way the theater is set up. This theater faces the harbor. And so as you've got 25,000 people screaming, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians," for 2 hours, that sound is going to be reverberating out into the water. It's going to be a huge commotion. What does Rome want? What's one of the things that they fight to have? Order, peace, calm. That's right, Pax Romana. So this is a major thing if you've got this mob going on. And so Paul goes, the city clerk goes before the crowd and quiets them down, and he says, "Look, everybody knows Artemis is great. If the silversmiths have an argument with Paul, they should see that he's arrested or that charges are made or whatever. But this is the important part. In verse 40, as it is, we are in danger of being charged with rioting because of what has happened today. In that case, we would not be able to account for this commotion since there's no reason for it." And so he dismissed the assembly. So he steps in because he's nervous that the city, which has a lot of imperial clout and a lot of imperial recognition, there was a temple for the emperor's cult there at Ephesus. He's worried that word's going to get back to the emperor and that they're going to have some of their privileges revoked, maybe even some of the business that has helped make them such a prosperous place. So he steps in and calms it down. But all this shows us that the gospel is having a tremendous impact in the culture there within the city. This is the most, I think, city-wide attention that Paul has had to this point. It's a really big deal, and it helps us to see that for Paul and Paul's ministry in this place, it's changing a culture, and there's some rub, some irritation when the gospel comes in and upsets the apple carts enough, and that's what happens for Paul. Now, with that part, let me kind of talk back about something that's going on in the background while Paul is in Ephesus, because he's continuing his letter writing. He's continuing his ministry. As we mentioned last week, he wrote 4 letters to the Corinthians. We think that 3 of those 4 are while he is in Ephesus. We mentioned that 2 of them are lost, and I've included the references where we see him mentioning those letters. The second letter that Paul sends to Corinth is our 1 Corinthians. And in it, he attempts to answer some questions that the Corinthian church has, but instead it seems that it causes some conflict. Now, Paul references in 2 Corinthians 2 that he actually goes to a short visit. So during this time while he's in Ephesus, if you factor in his letter, he leaves Ephesus and takes a short trip over to Corinth. So if you can see just across the ocean there, he crosses, it's almost a straight over leap. The line, the mark isn't put on the map because we don't know exactly when to put it, but this is the most plausible explanation. Paul goes over there and tries to persuade the people. And he calls it a painful visit. It seems likely that the people have rejected Paul and he doesn't have time to sort out all of the mess. And so he has to come back because the time when he goes over is probably in late fall when sailing season is about to be over. And if he stays too long, he won't be able to leave Corinth through the winter months. The sailing shuts down from about late October, early November through to about March or so because the Mediterranean just has so many storms and it just gets too dangerous.
I think it shuts down in
September, yeah. There was a gray line, and we'll see that in a later week, that sometimes they would go up and sometimes they would push it. But in Paul's day, yeah, they would go in September, October, anytime in October was iffy. But even over land, you would see the roads closed down around November through February, March. Different reasons because of the weather and that sort of thing. So Paul is only able to make a short trip. He's unable to resolve the problem in Corinth. He has to go back to Ephesus, and he writes one of these unknown letters, the sorrowful letter. So we get the idea that he just bawls them out and calls them to account. This letter was intended to bring repentance from what we know of it in reading 2 Corinthians. And in 2 Corinthians 7, what Paul says there makes us think that Titus is the one who goes and carries that letter. In Titus, we see in a couple of cases, he kind of has a ministry of dealing with tough situations. He may have a little bit of a more gravitas to him than Timothy does. He goes into some hard spots and seems to get results. So that's all been going down with Corinth while he's having a fruitful ministry in Ephesus. Another thing that may have happened while he's in Ephesus, and this is an alternative view. This is not the traditional view, but there's a lot of possibility to it. It's possible that Paul writes the prison letters from Ephesus. Now, we're not told in Acts of a prison Paul being imprisoned in Ephesus. But we're not told in Acts everything that we just said about Corinth, too, about Paul's trip over and that sort of thing. Luke's job in Acts isn't to tell us everything that Paul does in his 15 or 20-year ministry. His job, Luke's job, is to tell us how the gospel spread from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria to the ends of the earth. He summarizes, in some parts we know that he leaves out for good reason. So it's entirely possible that Paul may have been imprisoned in Ephesus, perhaps after everything went down with the 25,000 people in the theater and all that. If that's happened, the prison letters are Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, and Philippians. Now, this has become an increasingly popular view with scholars. N.T. Wright, who I've referred to several times, argues for this. My professor, Scott McKnight, has argued for this in a recent commentary, and he's just about convinced me. Because the letters to the Ephesians and Colossians, particularly Colossians and then also to Philemon, talk about Paul, in Philemon, Paul says to Philemon, prepare a guest room for me because I may be going to you shortly when I'm released. You get a sense of a lot of traffic back and forth. Paul mentions Epaphras in the book of Colossians, who shared the gospel with them and now sends greetings to them. So there's a lot of foot traffic from Epaphras back and forth that we can see just in that one letter. That doesn't seem as likely if it's a Roman imprisonment. Yes, he could have traveled. Yes, travel was common. But to have that much that fast, it seems unlikely. So this is, I'm telling y'all just because it makes a lot of sense. We'll talk about it a little bit more. This is not the traditional view, but it's one that's kind of growing. And anyway, it's a compelling case, I'll say that much. So Paul leaves Ephesus in spring of 56, and then he goes on to Macedonia. So he makes his way up the coast, and he goes over to Macedonia, to northern Greece. And there Titus meets him and tells him of the Corinthian response to that sorrowful letter that he'd written, where he bawled them out and told them, they needed to get right with the Lord. And the Corinthians had responded positively. And so Paul is excited, he's encouraged about it, and so he writes the fourth letter, what we know as 2 Corinthians. An essential theme of this letter is reconciliation. We've been given the ministry of reconciliation, Paul writes. But because they too have just been reconciled, Paul and the Corinthian churches. Also in this letter is when we see him mention an offering to take up for the church in Jerusalem, which was in a hard time, in a situation of famine. And Paul begins in several of his letters now mentioning the collection for the poor in Jerusalem. Paul makes his way down. He finally gets to Corinth, and he stays for about 3 months. From here, Paul writes the book of Romans, considered by many of us to be his magnum opus. One of the most dense piece of writings you'll see in all of the ancient world. Chock full of scriptural references and allusions, chock full of quite a dense bit of theological reflection. The central message, depending on who you ask, is maybe thought to be righteousness comes through Christ. I would say even more so, the central message is righteousness that makes Jew and Gentile one family together. That's the shift even since I wrote out these notes, but There's a lot more about how the Jew and the Gentile believers are now members of one family. And you see that from the beginning verses to the end. And we might have a separate study on Romans one of these days. Give me about 2 or 3 years to study it. All right. Paul goes back the way he came. He goes back up through along the coast of Greece. He stops at Philippi for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now, this is one of those fun little things in Acts 20, verse 6. Luke writes, "We sailed from Philippi after the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and 5 days later joined the others at Troas." So many went ahead to Troas. Paul and Luke, it seems, stayed behind. Why? In Philippi, you have Lydia. Lydia is a dealer in purple goods, a wealthy person. Now, this is my own theory, but I think Paul stays behind to celebrate the feast with Lydia at her villa, at her nice house. I think he's celebrating the feast there with her. Because when he gets to Troas, there seems to be a much smaller, perhaps a smaller Christian community. Definitely, we don't see them in a house. And this is what's fun. You remember the story of Eutychus, the young guy who Paul's getting long-winded, kind of like I am. And he falls asleep, falls out of a window. We're told he fell from the 3rd story, meaning this was an apartment building. This was not a house. And so you can imagine them all packed in there to hear Paul preach. And I think that's some of why Paul doesn't go there until after the feast is over. It's a very human, practical observation. Don't know that it makes any value in a Sunday school lesson, but that makes sense to me. And so from then on, Paul continues to make his way toward Jerusalem. And we read at the end of Acts 20 where he calls the Ephesian elders to come meet him at Miletus. And he says his goodbyes to them as he's expecting to go on to Rome and maybe not make it back their way again. And that concludes his 3rd missionary journey. What questions do you have?
You were talking about I can't remember the name, but the goddess of fertility.
Yeah, Artemis.
Seems to be a pretty big connection between the pagan gods, or gods and goddesses, and the Nordic gods and goddesses, just with minor variations of the name. Is there any historical connections that can be made between that, between maybe people being from the same region going to those other areas to branch out? Or
The question, and I'm summarizing for video's sake, is there any connection between the pagan gods that we see in the Greco-Roman world and then what are found in the Nordic areas later? I only know one possibility with that. The area of Galatia, it was named because the Gauls were there. They originated from that area and then made their way up to the north. Those became the Gaelic peoples of Scotland. So that's some northern movement there that I know of from this area. I don't know anything beyond that. You're good. I don't know anything beyond that. It'd be worth checking out. Yeah, maybe. Interesting question. Other questions? Olita.
About how old was Paul during this time of ministry?
Yeah, so this is 53 to 56. So we estimated putting him at 0 AD, so he would be mid-50s about. And that'd be a fair estimate for him. Anything else?
So Paul was in prison or we think that he might have been in prison in Ephesus. Do we know if it was for starting the riot or if it was for
Yeah.
or just causing business to be bad?
Yeah. If Paul was imprisoned in Ephesus, it would sure make sense that he might be charged in the riot. Now, we saw earlier with his Philippian imprisonment, he gets thrown into jail because he's the demon-possessed girl that was a fortune teller. He cast the demon out of her, and the owners get upset with him for ruining their business plan. And so people get upset when money is involved. And they can find reasons to have a legal argument. Would they have paid any attention to him if it didn't affect their finances? Probably not. So yeah, the old adage, follow the money, that was true then too. And that's part of why I like teaching Paul this way, because I want us to understand he's in a world that's every bit as nitty gritty and practical and pragmatic and just a constant negotiation, just like ours is. And he's calling people to follow Christ in that world. He doesn't live in some isolated bubble where he's just saying, love your neighbors and tell them about Jesus. Be good to one another. Forgive as the Lord has forgiven you. He's not saying that sort of thing in isolation. He's saying that in an environment where he's facing constant pressure from it. He's telling them to go and live as Christ followers and to stop giving to, and sacrificing to pagan idols in a community that considers if you're not sacrificing, then you're not pulling your weight and keeping the gods appeased. And if something bad happens, you're to blame for it, and I might suffer because you're not being faithful. That's the world that Paul's writing into. And so, I would love us to see that because we have to make hard decisions to follow Christ. It comes with a cost. Paul's did too. And so that helps us to have a freshness as we're reading his words and seeing his life. It's not a clean world that he's living in. Good question.
In other words, we should not have any fear to go out and disciple.
Don't have fear to go out, but don't be surprised when it's hard. And don't be, there's a reason Jesus said we have to be as innocent as doves, but as shrewd as serpents. We have to be aware of our world and the consequences of our world. And sometimes following Jesus means we have to be thoughtful and almost we have to be wise in knowing how to be faithful. Paul didn't just run in and he wasn't always brash. Sometimes he was. But sometimes he was very shrewd in the way that he answered and spoke.
Do you think the Corinthians didn't know what they were getting into? He brought them into the fold and brought them in as disciples of Christ, and then basically chastised them a lot, but only after they weren't going to go back to their old ways. So.
I think probably like all of us, the Corinthians, there was more to following Christ than what they understood when they accepted him. And that's what the rest of following Jesus is about, is learning to surrender more and more. And yeah, that makes it tough. So it's a good question. All right. Book recommendation for the day. This is a good one. My Paul professor, Randy Richards, he wrote the letter writing book. This one is entitled Paul Behaving Badly. Was the Apostle a racist, chauvinist jerk? And they deal with questions because Jesus is popular, like out in our world. People that don't follow Jesus or aren't Christians or not in the church, they still like Jesus. Paul is not popular, even in Christian-ish America, even in the church. People that love Jesus and want to follow him don't like Paul so much. Randy gets into why that is and helps uncover some ways that, frankly, Paul is misunderstood. This is a good one. If any of those issues come up, he has a specific chapter on Paul and race and Paul and women and Paul and households and lots of different stuff. It's a worthwhile book. All right. Let me pray first and then we'll go. Father, thank you for this time that we get to study your word and learn about Paul and learn about how we can learn from his life of faithfulness. And I pray that you would help us this week to just to be sensitive to you as we go. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, I have your answer sheets up here at the front if you want them. And thanks for coming.